Okay. Our final talk today is Dr. Christine Hauskeller, who is professor of philosophy at the University of Exeter in the UK. Christine is an expert on critical, decolonial, and feminist theory and studies new biomedical approaches. Recently, she published Philosophy and Psychedelics, Frameworks for Exceptional Experience, and with Claudia Schwartz, the issue Critical Psychedelic Studies, Interdisciplinary Science Reviews in 2023. Christine co-founded the transdisciplinary research group Exeter Psychedelic Studies. She teaches, supervises, and researches diverse questions regarding ethics, politics, and psychedelics. Please welcome Dr. Christine Hauskeller.
Good morning. Thank you for coming. So I am talking also, it's the last in the sort of more science-based talks in this conference. Tomorrow we have a slightly different focus, but I will be talking in particular on the role of experience in psychedelics. And I think we need to use this thing here. Have you figured out how this works? This one? How did you make it? Ah, okay. Okay, good. So briefly, this is about the primacy of experience and the role it plays, taking a sort of philosophical perspective. We might say, this is a sort of summative overview, that modernity favors an objective abstract science that is geared towards creating property in things or know-how, and that is closely intertwined with techniques that actually establish such know-how as protected through techniques such as copywriting or patents. Now, there are some questions of why is this? Especially when we look at psychedelic therapies. Why is the personal exceptional experience undervalued, which is a claim I'm making here, when I think this actually would increase experiences of alienation in therapy? I will outline this further. And then the science itself seems to be disjointed and ideological, and I will give an example for that, which is again leading to false starts and to alienation in therapy and in knowledge seeking. So the history of 20th century philosophy has been actually is full of people who actually try to consider the role that the relationship between the material, the stuff, and the experience plays, especially when we think about psychedelic or psychological treatments, but it's a very general approach to think, actually, what does science show us? What does it do and what is it built on? Is there such a thing as an objective perspective? So it has been argued, I think very convincingly, by not least Nancy Cartwright, for instance, that the fundamental laws in physics do not describe regularities that exist in nature. They describe regularities that become visible when you take a particular workshop approach to studying something disconnected from the wider environment. So the laws of physics, the mathematized laws of science describe idealized objects in the form of models. We have models of reality which are idealized and abstracted. This Cartwright spoke of the interpretive model, a term I like because that word interpretation gets us back to hermeneutics and to the meaning-making contexts that are central to this talk. There's also Carolyn Merchant's book, The Death of Nature, from the 1980s, in which she looks at the ways in which, in the history of modern science, we find that the models that it has developed are geared towards subjugating nature and exploiting nature. So we have an idea that there are abstract concepts that inform idealized models, which are used to then construct real-world applications to predict what happens next in the life world. Yeah. So within the science space, we find what Whitehead has called the bifurcation of nature. But first, let me start with this quote here that I've put there on the top because I like it. There is but one nature before us, namely the nature which is before us in perceptual knowledge. Perceptual knowledge is a specific phrase, but let me just simplify it to experience. So Whitehead, Hegel, Husserl, Kant, many others have criticized bad abstractions. And the concept of the bifurcation of nature, which is not the same necessarily, I think, as between nature and culture or between body and mind. They are all hang together in some ways, but this one is the separation between the objective and the subjective, between that which exists supposedly externally and that which only exists for the perceiver from my point of view, this experience, this view that I have. So we can measure light waves and temperature. We cannot measure the perception of colors or hot and cold because those are very subjective experiences of temperature. At least that is what this bifurcation that Whitehead is criticizing is actually doing. So there is the actual stuff, temperatures and light waves, and only these weird humans have the idea that this has something to do with how they feel or what they see. There is an example I want to give in which this sort of difference was described, I think, very well, a debate that has been famous in developing this emphasis on experience and highlighting the role of experience, and that was Henri Bergson criticizing Einstein. So the debate between Bergson and Einstein, which is highly publicized, and Jimena Canales wrote a really nice book summarizing it 10 years back. Bergson rejected Einstein's what he calls metaphysical claims about the implications of relativity theory. Physics does not know, he argues, the true nature of time. The new true nature of time is duration. Clocks may divide the directed flow of time into something that on this round thing appears in these sort of divided up little spaces, which can be tacted more or less precisely, very precisely nowadays. But what we mean by time is an experience. It is the experience of duration, the way in which sometimes time is long and sometimes the same amount of time on the clock goes very quickly. So even that example, that famous example that Einstein brings about the sort of way in which time and light speed and wavelengths are interrelated, and why this means that the twin who goes out into space, traveling at near the speed of light, ages far less quickly than the twin who stays here on the planet Earth. Even that is not anything meaningful if we don't bring those two twins together and again compare their experience. Without the reference to the experience of time, time is not a meaningful concept. So it is the experience of duration, it is lived time and clocks without reference to this lived time measure nothing of relevance. A similar point has been made and developed also during the 20th century with respect to biology. What is life? Yeah, so let's move from physics to biology, getting us closer to psychology. So living is sense making, many say. It is about interpreting, it is hermeneutic. We do not live without making sense of the stuff that happens around us. And Schrödinger made in this famous little book that was actually speeches he gave in Dublin, What is Life, was reflecting on the new science we need that would help us to actually find something like a biology law type that would help us explain life. And we could say 20th century biology was full of trying to do that, from genetics to cell biology, microbiology, etc. Is there any rules about the ways in which we can have a grand theory of biological life? This grand unified theory has been attempted by many people in evolutionary theory, etc. And when I worked on genomics, I was very involved with this. Let's just summarize it here quickly. No such theory has been found. I, however, just found this book with this title, The Blind Spot, which has about half my reading list in my courses on philosophy of science on it. Some feminists are missing. But in this book, the authors Frank Gleiser and Thompson argue regarding the organisms that they are autonomous agents, drawing on a lot of philosophy of biology to make this point. To summarize one of their comments on this, a living system possesses autonomy and agency. It produces, maintains, and regenerates the parts and processes that constitute its functioning as an integrated, self-governing whole, that is the autonomy bit, while also both promoting environmental conditions favorable to its own existence and actively avoiding conditions that threaten it, which is agency. And very interestingly, as soon as you take a sort of organism view, a complex concept, going back to Kant, having gone through many transitions of rethinking it, you do find that this is a plausible explanation. So, what are then the conditions that enable experience or knowing? In the blind spot, they argue that we have a primacy of consciousness from all we know, plus a primacy of embodiment. Obviously, as is obvious, the word primacy, when you have two, is already problematic. But you cannot have consciousness without a body, a brain, a thing that actually experiences. Otherwise, the concept of consciousness relates to nothing in the lived world if it isn't an embodied actual consciousness that is concrete. On the other hand, the primacy of embodiment alone, of matter, of brains, of bodies, without consciousness doesn't get us to anything like describing the way we exist in the world. So they then speak of what they call the strange loop, that 1 and 2, the primacy of consciousness and the primacy of embodiment, are enfolded with each other. They are somewhat relating to each other, and that is what creates meaning. One author makes similar points as Merleau-Ponty when he talks of the conscious subjects and world that make each other what they become. Now, there is this thing in terms of neurophenomenology I will come back to again, when as a braiding through first-person accounts of consciousness with third-person accounts of the brain. When we look at contemporary psychedelic research, where there is maybe an attempt at actually overcoming at least some of this bifurcation of nature that I have been describing. So I will now go through a few blind spots and what I called manipulation in the title of my talk in psychedelic psychotherapy. What does the psychedelic science workshop do? How do its machines, abstractions, and explanations sit in relation to the life world? I will have one slide of each of the first 3 of these points, and then quite a few on the 4th one, because that's the example in which I try to highlight here. Okay, so what can images tell us, for instance, to get to the machines about psychedelics? There is this beautiful paper by Wall Harding and others where it says about the imaging technologies, paper from last year. We outline the major trends in existing data and suggest the modern development of psychedelic therapy has benefited greatly from the use of neuroimaging. Instead of now saying how it has benefited it, that is from the abstract though, important gaps in existing knowledge are identified, namely the relationship between acute drug effects and longer-term clinically relevant effects, which is the stuff we supposedly want to know. So we actually have little knowledge achieved from neuroimaging about that, which doesn't surprise us when we think that consciousness and embodiment hang together. The precise characterization of the effects of the receptor is missing, and the relationship with functional clinical effects of that is missing, and the possible impacts of these compounds on neuroplasticity is not well understood. And obviously, neuroimaging can't explain these things, because in order to do this, it needs to be connected to the other side, that is the experience, the patient presentation, etc., none of which you can actually neuroimage. So what do we do when we think that this is a very important component of psychedelic research? Is it, and what is its role? We might need to rethink that. Second, and that brings me back to the paper that Eduardo already spoke about, where we had this, one of our little subtitles in this recent commentary in Nature Mental Health was misguided focus on drug efficacy only. And that is the only thing I will say about the FDA decision. But the point was the question: do the available data show that the drug is effective in patients with post-traumatic stress disorder? And we wrote that this question refers to the efficacy of the drug alone. But the drug alone was not in discussion. In discussion, as Catherine as well said, was the drug combined with psychotherapy. So the point I want to make here is about institutional structures within which science and knowledge is operationalized. The FDA's limited remit enforces blind spot thinking, isolating the drug component in the proposed treatment and avoiding to look at the meaning making that is part of the clinical process. Now, this points us to a problem, the problem that if the regulation operates in this way, then clinical research is pushed towards prioritizing drugs and playing down or leaving out the psychotherapy component. This way in which institutional practices of validation and legitimacy or acceptance shape what scientists feel justified to even research is widely been studied in the last 25 years. Scientists can't choose things that they can't actually do. So there is a way in which the pharmaceutical medical industry complex actually emphasizes the material side, the drug side, versus what we might call scientific freedom and human needs, both of those together. Then the experience in psychedelic psychotherapy. I have written about some of this in an article in this book, Philosophy and Psychedelics. But mainly, when we look at psychotherapy, what do we need to unpack? We need to unpack the diagnosis, which is experience. I know, but I need more time. Diagnosis, which is experience-based. Then there is the treatment, which is experience-driven. Because when we give a psychedelic at whichever micro or macro dose, we actually expect that some experience can be achieved. And then we have an evaluation of the success of that treatment, which again is related to things that are experienced, such as, do people have metaphysical experiences? Can we quantify these, etc.? So on every level, from diagnosis to treatment and evaluation of the results, psychedelic psychotherapy is related intrinsically and inevitably to experience. So what does this then mean when we want to just look at drugs to cure a disease and not realize the ways in which psychiatry generally, and also here, actually works with experiences? Now, my example case, the manipulation of experience in the clinical setting. The mystical experience is a potential psychological mechanism to influence outcome in psychedelic therapy. It includes features such as oceanic boundlessness, ego dissolution, and universal interconnectedness, which have been closely linked to both symptom reduction and improved quality of life. In this review, 12 studies were analyzed for association between mystical experience and symptom reduction, Wright, Knight, and others in an article from 2022. I've said we look at bending the mind and the mystical experience, or this way in which psychedelic experiences are framed within the psychedelic clinical trials is a major concern. And my example on this here, my example for mind bending, is the integration process in the clinic about ensuring the desired outcome? How is this actually set up? Is there a set and setting designed that fabricates a particular dramatic, mystical experience through the music, through the prompts at the beginning, through the evaluation at the end, that goes on top of that in a certain direction? So there is this description that I want to get into now about that each dosage session is a hero's journey, and it is really the hero's journey that I got hung up a bit with. So there is this paper by Brower and colleagues from this year in which they talk about the trajectory of the typical psilocybin mushroom experience, and they have been collecting data from people tacting every few minutes how they were feeling during their psilocybin session and collecting these emotions, then classifying these emotions as going up and down, as positive and negative emotions. And so they have been describing the hero's journey as going up for about 90 minutes, coming down for about 120 minutes. And the emotions that are related to the coming up are the negative emotions: anxiety, nervousness, and excitement, nausea, tension, tingles, lethargy, breathing, laughter. The classification of negative and positive itself is another issue I leave out here. Then confusion, distortions, detachment, rumination, discomfort, and withdrawal. And in the come down, they have the positive emotions: contentment, joy, and relief, calm, occasional hyperexcitability, being comfortable, philosophical thinking, clarity, introspection, beauty, enjoyment, and repair, and talkativeness. Okay. So this journey goes like this. You come up and then you go down, okay? The whole thing relies on the come up, come down distinction. This is the curve that is drawn in all the trials I've been having people speak about. The hero's emotions go in a particular direction. So now you look at this graph and you see how the emotions are distributed. The negative ones are the come-up emotions, the negative in blue, and the positive ones are towards the end and to the sort of after 150 minutes, starts to get redder and redder. The direction of these Western journeys in psychedelics that are supposed to be very mystical goes the path that is pre-designed by the way we understand religious experience in our cultures. There is this trance state going up to God. Yeah? And God is always up. Yeah? There's never down. God's up. So to actually encounter something mystical, whichever God or goddess it is you might encounter, this up, closer, higher, is an interestingly and I think ethically problematic way of modeling the experience, because I do think it matters. We find that in indigenous descriptions, the hero's journey goes the opposite direction. It goes down, and then you come back up. There is the water and the water snakes, and there is an underground world in which you dive, and you see this in many descriptions and imageries. So it also has a sort of trajectory and a curve, but it is the same curve the other way around. Now, I do think it really matters which metaphors and models we use to describe the psychedelic experience. If we have a journey that goes with a dive under and then a coming back up, then that would explain exactly why people first feel really not so good and then feel getting better and better. It was sort of, to me, that sounds very smooth. You know, what they have in this paper is a perfect trajectory for a journey that goes down and up. But what they have written with it is a journey that goes up and down, which really doesn't make much sense when you read it. So there is, however, an important difference. Why it matters to me which way of the curve we use is that depending on the description, the hero that comes back up into this real world from their psychedelic or other journey is here in a sort of refreshed, empowered, powerful way to actually value this life world we live in, the here and now, and maybe make this world a better place, to put it very pathetically. Whereas when you come up, and this is sort of the top, and then where you land, where we sit, is just the down, then what you want is go back up again, right? The description implies that the real world we live in is actually not the most valuable place in which to spend our time and effort. There is a tendency, this typical tendency of our predominant ideologies to actually seek something beyond that is the real stuff or the important and beautiful and perfect stuff. But in the phenomenology of experience and as an ethicist, this is the world we live in. And it really matters that this world, which place it has within the psychedelic therapy modeling, if we want to achieve some positive change for individuals as well as society, appreciation of the life world seems critical. So blind spot science is bad science and bad ethics. The questionnaires direct the process of meaning making towards these metaphysical heroes' journeys in the wrong direction. They standardize individual and standardize, which denies individuality. And they bend the minds of their patients to achieve a particular type of experience that is modeled, which may has implications, as I've tried to show, that are highly problematic. So we need better research and better metaphors. And I said earlier, the neurophenomenology might be one way in which psychedelic research could really try to overcome some problems of the blind spot I've described. We need an experience-based science, and seeing that all the data collection, if it can't relate to the experience of humans, doesn't make sense. And we don't want to have that experience just the outcome of strategic manipulation. There might be a way in which we have a lot of experience with psychedelics in the underground, the so-called underground, of the people who have been using psychedelics in the live world, that actually might help science to become better. My final slide is as good a quote. I believe that these agents have a part to play in our survival as a species, for that survival depends as much on our opinion of our fellows and ourselves as on any other single thing. The psychedelics help us to explore and fathom our own nature. And I think this is a quote by Humphrey Davis that many people have been using, or Humphrey Osmond in this case, sorry. I like it because it emphasizes the experience part, and a hope that everybody who does psychedelic therapy is actually connecting with the endeavor. We just need to make the endeavor better. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you to all of our speakers. We're going to take a break and we will return at 11:10. Yeah.